I want to take this opportunity to wish everyone the best of health, lots of happiness, peace, prosperities, and harmony for Sarawak.
Hi everyone. Recently, the Deputy Premier of Sarawak, Dr. Kui Hian, posted a video regarding Countdown 2025 to welcome New Year. So let's watch the video together.
In a few days' time, there will be countdowns all over the world, and Sarawak will also have an official countdown, which is at the Kuching Waterfront.
The New Year 2025 is coming, so everywhere, all over the world, they're gonna do the countdown for 2025. So Sarawak also going to do the same. And for Sarawak State Government, the official countdown will be happening at the Kuching Waterfront. For that, Kuching Waterfront is getting ready to welcome the New Year 2025, and they have lined up few other activities as well. Let's continue.
It has 4 segments, started at 8 a.m. in the morning, and the pre-concert countdown started at 8 p.m. but the official countdown concert started at 10 p.m.
At the Kuching Waterfront, they are planning something big. There will be 4 segments of programs, which will be starting from the 8 a.m. in the morning. Can you imagine, from the 8 a.m. until 1 a.m. in the next day? So it's a very big program. So the big concert will be starting from the 8 p.m. and official countdown program going to be starting from 10 p.m. You can enjoy the whole things if you join us there.
For those living in Batu Kawa, for the 3rd year, we have been organizing for the local countdowns and at the Batu Kawa Riverbank Park.
There is another big announcement for the Batu Kawa resident. You know, Batu Kawa Riverbank Park, they are also going to be happening the countdown program. This is the 3rd year in a row, because last 2 years they organized some other program as well. So this year also they are planning something. What they are planning, let's watch.
It starts also at 8 p.m. with concerts as well as fashion shows and so on. But the official fireworks is at 12 o'clock midnight.
They also having a concert and fashion show. Everything will be starting from the 8 p.m. But the official fireworks will be starting from the 12 a.m. because at the midnight.
Everyone is welcome to join the official countdown at the Kuching Waterfront or the local community countdown at Batu Kawa Riverbank Park.
So Dr. Kui Hian inviting all of you to join these programs. So if you are nearby to waterfront area, this is the official countdown program. You can join us at the Kuching Waterfront, or if you want to join the local community countdown program, you can go to the Batu Kawa Riverbank Park. These both places is really happening. Lots of things will be happening. So this is a great opportunity for you to enjoy a good time with your friends or with your family, or you just can have some good time over there, because government really plan and the local leaders make this happen.
May 2025 be annals marvellous for Sarawak nation building. I want to take this opportunity to wish everyone the best of health, lots of happiness, peace, prosperities, and harmony for Sarawak.
Dr. Kui Hian wishing everybody a very good year ahead, which is very kind of him.
If you like my updates, please follow my social media and jangan tengok saja.
If you like this kind of update, you can follow Dr. Kui Hian. As you know, I always make video of him because I like the updates he provide time to time. I will posting his Facebook link down there, and you can follow me too at the Kuching King or the Life of Rony or Kuching Explorer. I'll be available everywhere. You can just find me anywhere. Alright, thanks for watching us, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Hope you will be joining us at the countdown program. Bye.
And jangan tengok saja.